Well, right now there are conflicts going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the United States is trying to move in and act to calm the waters somewhat. We thought it'd be a good day to help us understand all of what's going on, how this all came to be, and why so many people are very concerned about these high levels of tension in that part of the world right now. Joining us on the line is Michael Rubin with the American Enterprise Institute. He's a former Pentagon official, the author of Dancing with the Devils, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. Michael, thanks for joining us here. We greatly appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start out. First of all, it started when the Saudis decided that they needed to execute a cleric, a Shiite cleric. Who was this person, and why did the Saudis feel they needed to execute him?
Well, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr was really the Arab Spring leader in Saudi Arabia in the eastern province. Now, the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is largely Shiite, even though we think of Saudi Arabia as a Sunni country. And it also is the place where you have most of Saudi Arabia's oil being developed. But there's something also going on in the background. Of course, the price of oil has been plunging. Saudi Arabia has implemented austerity measures, and as these austerity measures were coming into effect, the Crown Prince, who also happens to be the Interior Minister, Mohammed bin Nayef, decided to carry out these executions. In a way, it's almost reminiscent of what we have in Russia with Vladimir Putin. Whenever the economy goes south, he tries to rally people around the flag with some sort of outrage.
Now, this did not go over well in Iran, and there were actually protests, and they sort of ransacked the Saudi embassy there, something that doesn't happen unless the government stands by and allows it to happen, correct?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, in effect, what we have are two countries in a breakneck competition to see who can throw fuel on the fire with most efficiency. What the Iranians did was burn the Saudi embassy. The firefighters really didn't come for 12 hours. What's not so much in the headlines is the United Arab Emirates diplomats had to give shelter to their Saudi colleagues because there's a fear that this was going to lead to a new hostage situation. And as you say, of course, this wasn't the first embassy sacking in Iran. We had the American embassy in 1979. We had the British embassy in 2011. We had the German embassy in 2007. We had the Danish embassy in 2006. And the Iranians are in a bad habit of really not respecting diplomatic property, and that's the definition, at least according to the Clinton administration, of rogue regime when you don't abide by the norms of diplomacy.
You just said the Clinton administration. Do you mean the Obama administration?
No, I'm going back to the Bill Clinton administration.
Sorry. Thank you. Michael Rubin, can I ask you, with regard to, you mentioned oil and how Saudi Arabia is implementing austerity measures because the price of oil has plummeted. Now, a lot of observers thought that in the last OPEC meeting that Saudi Arabia was going to lobby for an increase in oil prices by ramping down production. But it turns out the opposite happened. Was that because of Iran and Russia ganging up and sort of swinging the votes that way? And is this sort of being, this violence now that we're seeing, is this carried an OPEC argument that's being carried out into the streets?
Well, when it comes to OPEC and when it comes to the oil markets, you really have a perfect storm. On one hand, Saudi Arabia wants the price of oil to actually decrease a little bit because they want to preserve their market share, and if that hurts Russia and that hurts Iran, so be it. But what their real target is crushing the American shale industry, and not just the American shale industry. What really gives the Saudis, keeps them awake at night, is fears that the Chinese will develop a shale industry. So what the Saudis are all about right now is market share, market share, market share, even at the expense of low prices.
Okay.
Back in the 70s, the famous Saudi oil minister Yamani said, the Stone Age didn't end for a lack of stones. The Saudis today are taking a different perspective.
All right, and secondly, we saw tensions from Saudi Arabia toward Iran even before what started in Yemen. We saw Saudi Arabia complaining about this Iran nuclear deal and their fear that Iran is now going to have an easier time of it and be able to fund more terrorism. How much of that is playing into this latest round of tensions?
Well, that's a huge issue right now. I mean, the irony here is not only that both sides on the nuclear deal, the Iranians and the Saudis allies among the Arabs, feel that they can't trust the United States, but both the Saudis and the Iranians actively believe the United States is supporting the other side, and so our leverage has never been so little. At the same time, because the Saudis fear this Iranian empowerment, and the Iranians are on the verge of getting $100 billion. That's a conservative estimate, hard currency windfall and unfrozen assets. The Saudis are scared to death that the Iranians are just going to take this incitement and run with it, and therefore they have long accused Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who they executed, of being an Iranian agent, even though in the last few years, Sheikh Nimr had embraced nonviolence. In his past, he had actually been a member of a Saudi Hezbollah group, which was a proxy of Iran.
All right, so let me see if I can get one other thing in here. The Saudis and the Iranians not happy with one another. Saudis cut off diplomatic relations. These are the big players in that part of the world. The United States is working very closely, I guess, mostly with the Saudis in that part of the world right now, in places like Syria and other places. So what does it mean to the United States, and why should we be concerned? And just how tense are things in that part of the world right now?
Well, I mean, there's a few issues. The nightmare scenario, of course, is that Saudis and the Iranians would start shooting at each other directly. I don't think that would happen, but 17% of the world's oil flows through, is transported by ship through the Strait of Hormuz. Right. And last time we had to flag tankers during the 1980s, we had trouble. But when it comes to this desire to resolve the Syrian civil war, the Yemeni civil war, that's pretty much off the table. They're going to be fighting by proxy, but what my nightmare scenario is that it's not going to be limited to the Middle East. Remember, the Iranians had tried to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C., so what we might see is a rebirth of terrorism worldwide.
I hate to reduce a very complex international diplomatic issue like this down to a simple question, but whose side should we be on here?
You know, we should be on the side of anyone who's fighting the extremists. We shouldn't get involved in a sectarian war. We shouldn't have to pick Sunni versus Shiite. You know, both the Saudis have funded terrorism in the past, although today the problem is more with the Turks and the Qataris. On the Sunni side, the Iranians still fund Hezbollah. They're a threat to our U.S. Navy. We've got to say that anyone who promotes extremism, they're not going to be a friend of the United States, and it doesn't matter which flavor of extremism they favor.
And you're talking about Saudi Arabia's financing of terrorism as if it's past tense.
Well, once the Saudis started experiencing blowback, and this is in the years after 9/11, for example, many of your listeners have seen the movie The Kingdom about a terrorist attack in Saudi Arabia. That's when they started getting serious. There's still a problem in Saudi Arabia, but they've started to learn their lesson, and this is a lesson that goes throughout the Middle East, that all these countries will fund extremism so long as it's conducted outside their borders. Once they start experiencing the terrorism inside their borders, they start to get serious.
So,
Saudi Arabia started to get serious. Unfortunately, Iran has yet to.
As odious and problematic as Saudi Arabia may be, they're still sort of the better horse in this fight versus Iran, if I could mix three metaphors at once. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. It's deja vu all over again, but absolutely. The Saudis are the better horse, and actually, frankly, the United States also has to recognize that alliances should mean something, and we can't simply throw out an alliance which is dated back to February 14th, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt met with Ibn Saud on his way back from the Yalta Conference. We shouldn't be throwing that out willy-nilly, but there's a sense in the Middle East that that's what we're doing. Yeah. And remember, when President Obama has talked about pivot to Asia, that makes sense strategically, but what everyone in the Middle East hears is echoes of the East of Suez speech that the British gave in the late 1960s, which presaged their rapid withdrawal from the area. What many of our allies fear in the Arab world is abandonment at this point.
All right, we're going to have to leave it right there. Michael Rubin with AEI, thank you so much.
He's a smart guy. That's why we have him on.
That's right. I learned a lot there.